This last session is, well, it is to be a wrap-up session, but we've decided to change it around. It's a little bit different from what was on your program. We have a terrific panel again of three people. To my far right, Professor Lawrence Pratchett. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra. He has a very extensive bio, which is in your paperwork there, but I would say his work focuses on public participation and the engagement of citizens in influencing policy decisions, especially at the local level. Next to Lawrence is Annette Owttrim. Annette, who's just agreed only minutes ago to come onto this panel, so thank you, Annette. Annette is, in fact, I had to twist her arm to be here today, and I'm so glad I did because she's a terrific contributor. And she's the General Manager of Health Solutions at Aspen Medical. Now, many of you will have heard of Aspen Medical. Aspen, of course, won the recent contract, the big international contract to run the Ebola response, and does some extraordinary work around the world and has a very, very big international workforce. Annette is in charge of the health solutions and, I believe, Annette, the innovation. And next to Annette, of course, is Professor Peter Leahy, who you well know, General Peter Leahy, who was the former Chief of Army, who, as I said earlier, has been the driver behind this conference this year and has been persistently insistent that the university do this, and he single-handedly has pulled it together and got all the speakers here. So we really do have a great deal to thank him for. The way we're going to run this session is I have three questions that I want to ask the speakers to reflect upon. They're questions that come out of what we've heard so far today, but I want to give you these questions too, because this is what we want you to think about tonight and bring back tomorrow, particularly our young leaders and young leader aspirants who are here. Because we want to discuss this in one of the sessions with you tomorrow. So the questions are, again, reflecting on what we've heard so far, what is it that we want to lead? What is it that we want to lead? What are the issues? What are the issues Australia needs to be really thinking about that need serious leadership consideration at the moment? Secondly, what are the qualities and characteristics that it would take to be those leaders? If we're looking at what we need in this country, what we need to consider when we're talking about leadership, what are the characteristics and qualities it would take to be that leader? And thirdly, how will future leaders differ from our current leaders? So how will our future leaders be different from our current leaders? So they're the three questions I'm asking each of our speakers or panellists to reflect on today. Now, given that Professor Lawrence Pratchett was in fact the author of those questions, I'm going to I said it just like I made it up myself, didn't I? I'm going to throw it over to you, Lawrence, to begin with that first question. Given what we've heard today, what you've heard various people say, and particularly some of the young leader aspirants say, what do you think it is that we want to lead? What are the issues?
I knew that it was a bad idea to give you those questions, Virginia. It's going to be a tough one for all of us to answer. We know that there's some big issues. There's the environmental problems that we know we face as all the global warming issues. There's the migration problems that we know are major problems across the world, and so on. I'm struck by the fact that I'm not really interested in the 2 or 3 global leaders that might make a difference there. They're important, but I'm not sure that this is what we would be discussing now, because that's just such a big issue to take on. So I want to think more about what would a future leader want to lead on. And to me, the big issue that I think came out this morning, but in a different way from the way I'd have understood it before, until I started reflecting on it anyway, is actually about issues of inequality that still are deep-rooted both within our own society here in Australia, but also deep-rooted around the world. And those issues of inequality are gendered. I had thought about gender inequality many times, but I hadn't considered it to be a big issue until I listened today in terms of Australia, but I am fairly new to Australia, so hadn't really reflected on the gender issue in leadership in Australia in the way that I did today. But clearly there remains inequality in gender. But I'm also thinking about the growing disparity in inequalities, in economic inequalities, between those that have and those that don't have. And we're aware, if any of you that's read Thomas Piketty's book from last year will be very aware of just how big the gap between the top 2 or 3% of wealth in the world is and where the rest of the world is. Even in economies like Australia, the gaps in wealth are immense, and the power that gives the control of wealth and what happens to that wealth. That's supposed to stay on for an hour now. Sorry. The gaps in wealth inequality seem to be important, overlaid possibly by other inequalities as well. So the gender inequality, there remains, I think, significant race inequalities, an issue that I'm very conscious of in Australia, which I was never really conscious of before I came to Australia, is the inequality between Indigenous people and what we might term, I suppose, mainstream economic Australians. Those types of inequalities, I think, are the issue more than anything else for me that would be the focus of the type of leaders who are in this room. So I would hope that as leaders we start to think about what we're doing to break down the inequalities. And the issue for those inequalities for me are not to do with the way in which individuals accumulate wealth or the way in which an individual behaves in a racist or sexist manner. Those are important things. But more importantly, I think it's something that was said this morning, which is the way in which so many of our practices are institutionalized in such a way that even the best-willed person who wants to break down those inequalities finds them almost impossible to do. So the type of issue that I think we would be focusing on more than anything else in the next 10 to 20 years certainly would be trying to break down the inequalities that pervade our society.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lawrence. That's certainly given us some very good food for thought. And again, we could have a whole panel just on the issue of inequality. Annette, what do you think are the issues crying out for leadership?
The first one I think would be education, and not just as in a university education or high school education. It's around literacy, health literacy. We spend so much money in the health sector, and most of that is because we don't have health literacy. If we can improve the education standards of every Australian, then we'll be able to improve their opportunities for economic sustainability, and with that will then follow the social determinants of health, and then we'll start to achieve some of the bigger picture issues such as health, which is escalating at a rate which we can't keep up with. Together with that will be the ageing population and how we're going to work with the ageing workplace, what those challenges will look like, and how a younger person will lead the older workplace, or the older employees, who will have obviously had a lot of experience. And I think that'll be a challenge for Australia, where in many other cultures they still live as a extended family unit. And in Australia we've lost that, and we're spread across the nation or across the world these days. So we've lost the art of communicating and respecting our elders, but that's going to need to be something that will be very important in order for people to be able to work together in the workplace.
Very, very important point. Peter, what do you think are the issues crying out for leadership?
I'm going to start back in May of 2000 when they promoted me general. Somewhat to my amazement and my wife's bewilderment, I asked myself the question, what do generals do? And it's not as though it's there, and I think you're asking the same question here, what do we do? And I've reconciled that in my own mind, and I use this as I spoke to other senior officers in the military as they were promoted. I said, you go and find the biggest problem you can and go and stand next to it and do something about it. And there are plenty of big problems out there. But in some ways there has to be a zeal, a reforming zeal, that as a leader you want to make a difference. The legacy is important, but you want to make the lives of people better. You want to to be able to help people and feel as though you've made that contribution. So I ask it in terms of what's the biggest problem out there? Lawrence and Annette have mentioned a few. I think we've got a problem of community cohesion, and I don't mean Team Australia, but listening to the media today, we're getting too many different points of view. I like life to be a bit more simple than that. Can we cut through some of the peripheral issues and think about how we build that sense of cohesion? And I think John Howard was really good on this morning. He said, we have really good reason to be proud about Australia. So maybe we need to look at that pride. I agree with Lawrence, particularly about our Aboriginal communities. One of the things I did for 6 years in a row, I went out to some of the most remote Aboriginal communities in Australia. And the Army used to put about 200 or 300 soldiers out there for 6 months of the year, and we'd build roads or airstrips or sewage systems or housing developments, put a hospital in or something. And we should be ashamed as a nation for what's happening out there. We've really got to do something about that. And I know there's reasons why it's not working, and we hear about that too often. We must do something about that. I think, Virginia, with your insistence and support of others, I'm becoming something of a convert around gender issues.
I knew you would.
I'm just a
I
softie,
knew we'd
know.
get there.
But before you think it was all you, I've got to thank Jess and Brooke and Sarah and many others.
So you are a reconstructed feminist, as Mr. Abbott says he is.
I'm working on it. I think it's... I really hadn't, and I'm 37 years in the Army and infantryman. There aren't any infantry women. I come from a particular area. I have 3 sons, and I'm now starting to feel sorry for my wife. But these are the sorts of things I've not really thought about. And as we're thinking of doing this again next year, I'm going to need your help to bring more of these gender issues. But listening to Brooke and Jess and others last night, I think was it last night? Tuesday night. I thought, well, this is really serious. So I think we do need to do something about it. And my final point, again, now from my experience at the University of Canberra, we're not doing enough to incorporate the refugee populations in Australia. And I would say that particularly for the African populations that have come here, they are busting their guts to become good Australians. And I'm not sure we're helping them enough. And when you look at where many of them have come from, 16 years in a refugee camp in Egypt or Kenya or somewhere like that, haven't seen their families, don't know if they've still got a family. They want to make this country part of their life, and I'm not sure we're responding well enough to that. So that's another, I think we need to stand close to those things.
Terrific. There's a great list there and great food for thought. Well, just summing up there, we've heard, and I'm sure you've all got your own issues that you'd like to add to that, but the issue of inequality, race inequality, gender inequality, economic inequality, the issue of literacy, citizen literacy, the ageing population, community cohesion, refugee inclusion. These are all critically important issues that require leadership in Australia. So what are the qualities and characteristics that it would take to be those leaders, to lead in these areas? Lawrence.
I knew you were going to throw to me again first, yeah. I wanted to think about some of the things that Mike Pizzella said today and John Howard said and so on, about the types of leaders that they talked about. And what struck me was the way they were describing things that had a big influence on them, was the way in which those leaders existed in particular institutional and cultural periods when leaders had a position. They needed to be charismatic, but they also had to have a degree of authority. I was really struck when Margaret Thatcher died, watching some of the broadcasts of her and how posh her voice sounded and how structured her language was and so on. I'm not going to go into my critique of Margaret Thatcher because that gets me into trouble, especially among Australians who seem to think she was a wonderful person.
That was a hint.
But moving away from Margaret Thatcher, the thing that strikes me is that we have moved from a period when our leaders were very formal to a culture and an existence in organisations, in politics, in virtually every sphere of life, where leaders increasingly have to have those personal characteristics. I was really struck when Brooke said this morning, who's inspired you most to be a leader? My mum. Because I think that's really important, that personal connection with leaders is really important. And I think so some of the characteristics that we're going to need, as well as those things that John Howard talked about this morning in terms of authenticity, moral compass, and so on, are those things about how can you really bring your own personal position to play into the type of leader that you're going to be. So there's a standard debate that we have in business schools around, are leaders born or are they made? And we can keep going, we can keep rehearsing those arguments, but I think the types of leader we need in the future are going to be those ones who can connect very effectively with the people near them and enable those people then to connect with the people near them, and so on. And the whole advent, I was struck by the last session where we're talking about social media and its disruptive influence, but I think it has a disruptive influence on leadership generally, because some of my staff in the audience, Michael de Percy in particular, well known for his use of social media, and whilst it may not be at the same level as some of the big leaders in the world, I do get both criticised and congratulated by Michael in the social media he uses when and it changes the very nature of leadership when it's very personal like that. So I think some of those characteristics and qualities are very different from the types of leaders that came before and the types of leaders we'll have in the future, because I think the leaders of the future will need to be able to be very personable and personal in a way that maybe they weren't always in the past. They had a different persona, then they'd have a public and a private persona. I don't think that you can have that public and private persona anymore.
It's a very interesting point and a rather contentious one, I think. But can I just ask you, from what you've said, what would you, or actually let me put this to you, who would you say is an exemplar of the sort of leadership that you admire? That someone, he or she, that has those characteristics, those traits that you think make a really good leader?
Well, obviously my mum.
Yeah. he had to say his mum, didn't he?
And I'm looking around the room to make sure, no, he's not here at the moment. So, and again, this goes back to some things that other people said earlier on, that our current Vice-Chancellor, Stephen Parker, does epitomise much of that, insofar as he is very, very capable of being very personable and having very personal connections with every individual that he leads. He fits that characteristic of being a very, very hard taskmaster as well. And I think that's another quality of effective leaders, is that they have to push people, they have to drive people, as well as get them to follow them. And I think it's really important that as a leader you do need people to both follow you, but also to take direction, not by being told what to do, but by being encouraged and supported to achieve the things that you want them to achieve. So setting clear direction and then really letting people free to do that.
And I don't like to talk about people who aren't here, but I am going to say something about Stephen Parker. Something that struck me during the recent public discussion about university reform and education reform is he not only put his hand up or stood out and spoke very strongly against what all the other 42 Vice-Chancellors around Australia were saying. He's even done so knowing, this goes back to what John Howard was saying earlier this morning, knowing it was going to make him unpopular, possibly mean that he'd take a hit, and possibly it may not even be the absolute best thing for Australia right now, but he was being visionary, or has been very visionary in what he said, and courageous, and that whether you agree with it or not is not the point. It's just, I think, a really great example of genuine leadership that we don't see a lot of in Australia. Look, I'll move it on though. Annette, your thoughts about the characteristics and the qualities that it would take to be the leader of those issues that we've raised, and others.
Sure. I think that one of the challenges that's going to face the future is that...
Can I just get you to sit
you're
forward?
currently living in a very instant society. If you want something, there's an app, and suddenly you have an answer. When you want to, if you're a leader, you're often having to implement change, and change can take time. And you will have to learn about tenacity, you will have to learn resilience, you will have to learn how to communicate effectively and how to break down, you know, major problems into small problems, because it won't happen overnight. And a lot of people haven't experienced that yet, because everything, when I was your age, I didn't have access to the internet, I didn't have a mobile phone. And I know I'm getting old, but I'm not that old. So, you know, the world has changed so quickly just in my professional years, and I can see what that's likely to do for your professional years. I think the other thing is around communication. So many people now SMS, we email. We mustn't lose the art of being able to talk to people. People are still our most important asset, and we still have to understand how we communicate, how do we communicate effectively, and by communicating we'll be able to implement change and therefore be effective leaders when we're trying to make changes in the workplace or environmental or other major issues.
I think there's a slogan in that, Annette, there's no app for leadership.
Well, there we go. Yeah.
I think it works. It's a very, very good point. Peter, characteristics, qualities.
I think there's a fairly timeless element about this, because it is about people and it's about personality. And we can look at the different ways that the environment changes around us, but if you're trying to lead, you're trying to influence something. And in my business, it's convincing people to do something they fundamentally don't want to do. So how do you build that team? So I think that's the really important thing. How do you build a team? How do you make people feel as though they want to be part of an enterprise, that they're going to put a real effort into that? And I think that's the skill of most leaders. I'm going to refer to things that I used to talk to at the graduation parade at the Royal Military College, and I'd say to the young officers there, I can put the rank on your shoulder, but I can't make you a leader. You've got to do that. So just because you're in a position doesn't mean you're a leader. You've got to exhibit certain attributes and traits about that. And I'd say to them then, and you've got to prove yourself every day. So again, it's not as though, I was a leader yesterday, therefore I'm a leader today. It's something that has to happen every day. And you do that by setting and maintaining standards. That is, you say, this is what I stand for, this is what I expect of myself and what I expect of you, and I'm going to bust my chops to be better at it than you are. So let's set and maintain the standards. And that obviously means that you have to have a certain amount of belief in yourself. It really can't be an arrogant belief, but it's got to be a self-belief that in some ways sustain you in those periods when there are doubts about it. There has to be enthusiasm. People like to be around people who are enthusiastic, who are keen, and they love what they're doing. I think that's really important. You have to have a narrative. You've got to be able to communicate that narrative and stick with it. When we were changing the army back in 2006, I gave one speech 94 times. I was thoroughly sick of it. But if there were two soldiers standing anywhere, they copped the speech. You just grab it and say, stand fast you lot, here comes the speech. You've just got to get it out there, and you've got to be able to do that. I think you've got to have ideas and energy, and it came up a couple of times today. I think you've got to be attuned enough to be able to say, it's enough for them and it's enough for me. I've lost those ideas, or I've lost that energy. And have a look at what we see with our politicians. They still think they've got ideas, and their energy is probably going, and they don't just see the message that says it's time for you to go, and they hang on for too long. And I think the final point, or two final points, leadership is not about you. If you think, well, I'm the leader, you've got it all wrong. Two more final points. Leadership is a lonely place, and people don't appreciate this. It is a lonely place. Don't think that when you become a leader, you're going to be popular. And again, I'd say to the young officers, I don't pay you to be liked. I'm paying you to be respected and to lead. And the final point is that leadership is based on values and behaviour, and you've got to get those values right. You've got to be confident of who you are, where you came from, and where you're taking people.
Thanks, Peter. That's fantastic. Several years ago, I think it was around 2010, I interviewed you. It was actually about women in leadership, but you made that point about leadership being lonely, and I've got to say it really floored me to hear a general, a chief of the army, although you'd left by then, but to actually say that leadership was lonely, to admit that, I thought was quite startling, and it's given me cause to think a lot about the loneliness of leadership, and therefore the need to be very strong in your belief in what you're doing. It resonates, it certainly has resonated very strongly with me. I want to ask you, before we move on, just in a nutshell, and this is, I don't mean to be simplistic, but it's a simple question. Do you think a leader, given in your area of expertise, a leader can be made, or are some people never going to be leaders?
I think leaders could be improved. I think if you're a dud, you're a dud. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
And some people are just duds, aren't
they? And, well, let me put it, and I used to say, once a dickhead, always a dickhead. You can improve, but if you just don't have the basics there, if you can't communicate, if you don't believe in yourself, if you don't have a good set of values and all of those other things I talked about, well, I don't know, go and find a dog pack somewhere to lead. But and too often people don't realise that. So once a dud, always a dud.
And that's it in a nutshell. Annette, I want to come back to something that you said that reminded me of, again, what was raised early this morning by Mr. Howard, the issue of relationships. Your area, you work with, well, I mean, Aspen is enormous, but I know you work in very remote rural areas across Australia, Indigenous communities. You look after all the doctors and nurses and medicos that go into those areas, and it's tough. It's really tough. Sometimes you're working in areas where people don't necessarily want you there. It all boils down to, or must, to relationships. Now, Mr. Howard made the point that as a leader, you need to have strong relationships with what he called the immediately led. In other words, the people immediately under you. How does that work in your organisation? What's been your experience of the need to have those very strong relationships with those you work with?
What we've done is concentrate on cultural awareness and cultural intelligence as the first point, so that and this relates a little bit back to my previous life in the army, when I was working in Rwanda and I saw Band-Aid treatment. And that's unfortunately what's happened a lot in our Indigenous communities. If we want to make a change, we have to have people on board with us. And so we've concentrated on ensuring that people understand what the traditions of that particular community are, that they understand and have a very strong understanding of the skills required in that area. We put people into communities, they'll see diseases that they don't see anywhere else in Australia. If we pull a doctor out of a general practice in Toorak, they're not likely to understand some of the disease conditions that they will see in Arnhem Land. So we ensure that all of the supports are there, because what we want to do is make the health professionals' experience a positive experience. If they make it a positive experience, they'll return and they will also do very good work. So it's again making sure that the people are empowered with the right skills, be those cultural or clinical, to do a really good job. And then they can take that back to their own communities. One of the other areas that we do is ensure that they have a lot of support. So there's a 24/7 support line. We send clinical educators out with them. I mean, some of the locations that we go to are a plane and 2 days drive, and then they may be the only clinical person in the community. So that it is very, very remote, and it's very challenging, and sometimes people might be out there for 3 or 4 weeks with no one else to talk to. So it's important that that's where the resilience training and the comes in, is that these people are a really amazing breed. And perhaps if I could just quickly summarise, we recently had a presentation of our 3,000th placement, and the nurse who was presented with the award from the Health Minister, she'd written a small book with vignettes of her experience over the 3 times she's been out to one particular community. And the one that the Health Minister picked out, which I thought was amazing and very powerful, was that she talked of one of the ladies in the community, and they were talking, and they were both grandmothers, and they said, "Oh, well, what are you called?" And she said, "Yaya," and the Indigenous grandmother said, "Oh, I'm Miller," or something, and they said, "Oh, I don't like Yaya, you're Miller too." So each time this lady would go back, the clinician would go back, she would see the other grandmother. And then one day they walked down the street together, and the Indigenous grandmother took her hand, and they walked down the main road together. And our clinician wrote, "There I was, white hand in a black hand, two different cultures, but one Australia." And I think that probably wraps it up.
It's a beautiful story. And that gorgeous connection of, that common ground, they're both grandmothers.
That's right.
Beautiful. Lawrence, I want to come back to what you touched on earlier, and our third question, in fact, how will future leaders be different from our current leaders? In particular, I'd like your reflections on the international, bringing an international perspective into Australia, what you see. You mentioned that you hadn't thought much about the gender issue because it doesn't exist. Well, it exists obviously in the UK and elsewhere, but not in quite the same way with our unique, cultural attachments to stereotyping here in Australia. But that aside, and I don't mean just gender, that aside, from your perspective coming into Australia, what do you see about the current leadership that you think will change or needs to change for future leadership?
So, I'm in danger of getting myself into very hot water now.
Be courageous.
But
a good leader is courageous.
I think that if I could just reflect on the gender issue just for a quick moment, I think the reason that I hadn't considered gender to be such a significant issue in Australia until today is because I see far greater representation of both genders in Australia than I do in most European countries that I've been to, certainly in senior jobs. But I also recognise, just listening today, the challenges that are still there, which I suppose takes me then to the differences, the changes in leaders that we will need to see. And I think that our current leaders, whether we look at politicians, whether we look at business leaders, whether we look at university leaders in 40 other universities other than my own, and so on, there tends to be a degree of short-sightedness. I think the speed in which our environment changes now means that people think about the next big win and the quick, easiest win most of the time. There isn't a long-termism there. I also think that what will be different in the future, and I hear that today among the 6 people that sat up here this morning, is a real desire to challenge the status quo in a way that I don't think our current leaders do. Stephen Parker, in relation to education, has been an exception there, but I think most of the leaders that I've been around and near in Australia and have observed see a trajectory, they see a trend, and they want to be part of that trend. That then embeds all the institutions that we talk about, which create the inequalities that we've been talking about today. And I think if we really want to tackle the big issues, then future leaders have to be far more creative, far more entrepreneurial, and they have to be prepared to really challenge not only the value judgments of others, but also the institutions which then embed those value judgments. And for me, that would be the biggest difference I'd expect to see in 20 years' time when we're holding the 20th version of this conference, and people will be saying.
Oh, we'll still be sitting here in 20 years' time. Yeah, no, great point, a very good point, particularly the idea of the need to challenge the institutions. I think that's particularly pertinent, having just heard from our public sector leaders, 2 departments of secretaries, and whilst on the one hand they're acknowledging that there are problems within the APS when it comes to leadership and comes to gender, of course, and yet a reluctance to really challenge the very structure of that institution. Until those challenges are made, until people are brave enough, we're not going to see a great deal of change, I think. Annette, your thoughts about what is going to change or what will be different for our current, from our current leadership to future leadership?
Look, to be a bit controversial, I think we should go back a little bit to being less politically correct. We have become so correct that we have taken away innovation, creativity. We've lost some of the ingenuity that came with certain people. And I think that used to drive change. I mean, it's not just in political or business. We even see it on the sporting field. I mean, we used to have some real characters in the cricket teams. And now, if they do anything wrong, it's tweeted and, you know, it's all socially unacceptable and that person's terrible. So I think there needs to be a more balance between, you know, what we accept is socially acceptable without confining people to not being able to speak up and have a view and challenge, you know, as you say, challenge the status quo, but not be in trouble for it. Because I look at my daughter and her generation are so risk adverse. You know, what are we creating? They are so scared to make a mistake, but we need people to accept that a mistake is okay and to learn from that mistake, and that will challenge them to go forward. So if anything, I think we should really analyse the way in which we're developing our younger people and perhaps look at what do we consider to be socially acceptable and how far can we bend the rules a little bit.
I think that's a particularly important point, to be the need to be less politically correct. Peter, your thoughts?
I think it's become harder to be a leader, and in some ways I'm glad that that bit of my life is gone. Because it's your challenge now. How do you exist in this world that we've learned about today?
Why do you think it's hard to be a leader?
Well, harder.
Or harder?
Harder to be a leader.
You said earlier today because of the press.
Well, the press is the start because they're just all over the place. And I really wanted to ask Mark and Paul today. They're thought leaders in this community. So which thoughts do they decide and why do they decide to put those thoughts out there? Because they have an influence on us. But I think, and John Howard talked about it, the 40-40-20, I think he went to 30-30-40. There are less people who sort of automatically follow somebody, and that's not a bad thing, but it's going to be harder to be a leader. I think it's also going to be an issue that it's not just the close community around us now. You know, if anyone's sad enough in the room to barrack for the Collingwood Football Club, you would know that it was that community around Collingwood and the clock tower down there. We now need global leaders. And how do you influence, and Najib Ripart talked about the differences in cultures, how do we become global leaders? Not everyone's like Barack Obama. I think we all looked at him and thought he might have been a global leader. One of the books that some of the students from the university would have read, they were told to read anyhow, Mark Sageman, Leaderless Jihad. You actually don't need a leader because it's on the internet now. Those ideas are out there. It doesn't have to be someone in person influencing you to do something. The eyes are just there, the ideas are there, the videos are there, and you can follow those sorts of things. I think we're also seeing occasional leaders, and in some ways that's a good thing because the leader pops up when required and will do the task and maybe then needs to move away and someone else will come in, and that's the pace of change that we're going through. I do think that it's going to be harder to be a leader in the future, and that's your challenge, and hopefully by thinking about leadership, because it doesn't come naturally, thinking about it, you'll be the leaders that we need in the future.
Thanks, Peter. I think this comes back to something you and I were discussing earlier this week at a Leaders Roundtable at the University of Canberra with a small collection of national leaders, and the point was made that that a new generation needs to be given permission. The word permission was used a number of times. Permission to be leaders, permission basically to break out, to do their thing, to be courageous, to be authentic. But whilst hearing that and then looking out at the crowd here, I'm thinking, if I was, well, I am a young person, of course, but if I was a little bit younger, I think I'd be saying to myself, that's all very well, but I still have to work to a boss. I have to work to a very clear set of policy guidelines and procedures. How can I be this person who has permission to break out and be courageous and all that kind of stuff? How do those sort of two things balance?
It doesn't come from you, it comes from your boss. And that boss has to be generous to the extent that they allow you to make mistakes. And you have to be confident that when you make mistakes, it's a learning experience rather than a punishing experience. And again, and I can't help but go back to my military experience, and I think something, Annette, you were saying there. I know there are some military types in the room, off-stroke tactique, mission command orientated orders and those sorts of things. Give someone a job, give them the resources that you know they need to do that, give them the time to do it, and then get out of their bloody way. That is how people learn, rather than, what are you doing now? This is the classic micromanager. I can remember the first night I was duty officer in the battalion, 800 soldiers, they're probably all in the boozer, waiting for me to come down and say, excuse me, gentlemen, would you leave the boozer? You need to step forward and you need to make a decision, and you need to understand and have the permission that they're not always going to be the right decision. And what we were told those nights was, just make a decision. Get amongst it, will you? It might be the wrong one, but you're going to learn from that. And I don't think we're getting that permission to learn. And I'm not sure that our bosses are understanding that, hey, it's all part of a training mechanism. This is something that's going to make a better person a better leader.
But I think there's also dialectic to that, Peter, which is that the opposite side of that is that people have to take up leadership, and that certainly somebody who has both a boss and a lot of people who works to him, I find that my boss expects me to show leadership. He doesn't expect me to say, can I do this now, can I do that now? He expects me to go to him and say, I'm doing that now. By the way, I should have told you last week because it's too late for you to say anything about it now. And those sorts of things. He expects me to do that, and I also expect that from the people that work with me, that I expect them to actually come showing leadership.
But at what point, though, are you overstepping the mark? I mean, how do you know where the boundary is?
Well, hopefully, if you build trust with people, then you get the feedback at an appropriate time. One of the big axioms in the business world is fail fast.
Fail fast.
Yeah, but it is. And if you talk to any of the sort of wealthy business leaders in Australia and outside of Australia, they talk about fail fast, that you allow your employees or your sub-entities or whatever to have a go. But if they're going to have a go, get in there quick. And if you're going to fail fast, because then you don't waste a lot of energy and a lot of money on the issue. You can move on. What you don't want to do is have slow, tentative developments, which are incremental, and which lead to a big failure 10, 15 years down the line because you never really gave it a go. You just keep adding a path-dependent way, creating an inability to move out of it.
I think one of the other challenges that I've seen, not in our business but in other businesses, is this fear of being perceived as a bully. So I agree with Peter. When in the military, we identified what someone needed to do and we let them have a go. Whereas now, if you do that and the person fails, someone comes back and says to the boss, "I was set up for failure. That was bullying." So there's that balance of no, we're trying to develop you, and it really means that the leader has to have a really, really good understanding of how they articulate that they're providing an opportunity for growth. And if they don't get that right, then people are scared of it, so they won't get the opportunity and they'll do it themselves. So we don't create any leaders.
It's a good point. I want to finish off by asking each of you to give us an example of, and because I love stories about failure, and I often talk about my own, an example where you made a big mistake and what you learnt from it. And just taking as granted that you are all leaders, and just while you're thinking about that, I'll just throw in here my thoughts about how far, where do you draw the line, how far can you push your desire to change things, to not necessarily to be a leader, but to push forward on something you believe in. I guess a life adage has always been keep pushing until someone stops you, or until someone says you've gone too far. I've often been surprised when I've pushed forward and pushed forward and pushed forward, waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, who said you could do that?" who do you think you are? And it hasn't happened. And maybe because I'm deaf to it, but I just keep pushing forward, and that's kind of been my adage, and for some reason it kind of works. It can be a bit messy, and sure, there have been moments when I have fallen badly on my face, but luckily I've learnt to get up pretty quickly. So, to finish off for each speaker, bad mistakes you've made and what you've learnt from it. Lawrence.
So I was going to give a soccer story, but I won't. I'll stay actually in my work mode for a moment. And this isn't something I'm proud of, but it was a big learning lesson for me. In my previous job, before I came to be dean here, I was a head of department in a UK university. I'd only been head of department for about 3 months, and I had a staff member come to me very aggrieved about something, and we started knocking it about and got angry with each other, and I got very angry and shouted and told him to get out and so on, which led to then me spending 6 months trying to fix the problem. And so one of the things that I learned in that, which nobody told me about, was actually as a leader, it's always your job and your responsibility to stay calm, stay in control, and to not provoke the situation. And that's been a lesson that I've taken into my current job, and I challenge anybody that works with me to ever see me really get angry in a silly way. They see you may well have seen me get ruthless. But you'll never have seen me lose my temper. I think staying in control is probably a big lesson for me that I learned.
It's a great example, and I think we can all admit to moments when, similarly, where we've had to really learn that lesson of self-control. Annette?
Mine relates to a cultural issue. It relates back to when I was in Rwanda, and we had a patient who she was shot in the market during the massacre, and during the war there was some emergency surgery done and they left a pack in situ, so she got infected, but she was also pregnant at the same time, and I nursed her for about 2 months in the Rwandan ward until she had the baby, and then we would put her on 2 ventilators and fix up her lungs. So because I'd developed this relationship with her, the moment she came back into intensive care, I thought, this poor lady has been through a terrible time. I'll give her a really nice bed bath, wash her hair, give her powder, etc., which I did. And I felt good because I thought that was a very good thing to do. The next morning, the corridor outside intensive care was filled with all the ladies coming for their special hair treatment. But it got worse. That lady never accepted going back to receive care from the Rwandan, in the Rwandan ward. And then she started to neglect her son because she wanted the attention. 2 years after, it was about 12 months after we had come home from Rwanda, a surgeon who was in Rwanda with me had been in Geneva at a Red Cross conference. And can you believe this lady turned up there with a photo of myself and my nephew to hand to this doctor to say, I still want care.
Wow.
So even though I thought it was a good idea, you have to be aware of what's culturally appropriate.
It's such a good lesson about also sticking to protocols, procedures, that sort of thing, even though your heart tells you want to do more. It's a great story. Peter?
It's about being bold, and I wasn't bold enough in a particular circumstance, and I think some of the management texts talk about big, hairy, audacious goals. Have the confidence to be bold and go after those big things. And the world wouldn't have got to where we are if there weren't people of imagination and sail off and find islands and go to space and go to Mars. So be bold. And my example is around about the time we went to Timor, we were looking to go soon after that to Afghanistan. We did. We went soon after that to Iraq and the Solomon Islands, and we'd been in Bougainville, and a range of things were happening. And I devised a plan to harden and network the army. There were a lot of money attached to it, and I asked for $5 billion from government. They gave me the money, we hardened and networked the army, and then 2 years later we're still in all of those places, and government came back to me and said, you need more. And I was given another $5 billion to harden the army. I should have asked for 10 to start with. So use your imagination and be bold.
I love that. Be bold and don't hold back. Well, I'm going to throw in a last story just to finish that one, my story of doing something really foolish. Being in a war zone in Iraq, difficult circumstances, a lot of trauma, no sleep, and getting drunk before going live on air.
Oh.
Bad idea, bad idea. I thought it would help me stand up straight and answer those questions. Instead, it was just embarrassing. But the worst thing was I let down my whole team. We had worked our asses off to get a story together, and I let them all down because I was drunk. So I never drink before I go on air. I usually wait till I finish. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to take questions because we're going to do that tomorrow. Tonight, those of you who are going to the dinner, please discuss what you've heard. Come back tomorrow with concerns, issues, angst, questions, and your stories. Now, for those of you who would like to go to the dinner but don't have a ticket, we have a few to give away. So go and have a chat to Adam, sitting in the corner there with the pink tie, if you would like to go to the dinner tonight and you as yet haven't got yourself a ticket. I will remind you that it's business attire. Wyatt Roy is the speaker, federal member for Longman, all of 24 years old. I think it's going to be fascinating to hear Wyatt's speech. I think he has been thrown into a federal political environment where, being the youngest person there in the House, people are always asking him about youth issues, but not often leadership issues. So it'll be very interesting to hear what he's got to say tonight. Enjoy yourself this evening. Thank you for your attendance today and for being such a fantastic and engaged audience. And we've got a terrific bunch of speakers and more challenging discussion for tomorrow. So we'll see you here at 10 to 9 tomorrow. Until then, have a great night. Thank you. And thank you to our speakers, Professor Pratchett, Annette and Peter. Thank you.